My name is Mindy Zacharias. I'm the director of the MPA program at the Fels Institute of Government at University of Pennsylvania. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is our first public policy in practice event of 2022. So thanks so much for joining us virtually. So quick housekeeping, the first half of the event is going to be an interview by our wonderful distinguished fellow, Elizabeth Vale. And then the second part is question and answers from all of you. So if you're new to the public policy in practice, what you're going to do is send questions to me by direct message, so to moderator Mindy. And then during the question and answer, I will prompt folks to unmute themselves and ask questions. So when you send your question, also please include your name and your connection with tonight's event, whether you're a student or a friend, or sort of how you found out about tonight's event. Okay, I think that's all we have for now. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Vale.
Thank you, Mindy. And thank you, Colleen and John, who I think is here, John Lipinski, and all of our wonderful Fels students and a big portion of the Marshall Ganz fan club from Philadelphia. And especially Marshall Ganz, who is kindly joining us today from Stanford, where it's warmer. But thank you, Marshall. It's a joy and a pleasure and a privilege to have you. So as Mindy said, the first half hour are my questions, the second half hour are your questions, and we expect, actually yours are always best. So thank you for those when they come along. Let me briefly introduce Marshall. You all have his bio. He teaches at Harvard at the Kennedy School. He's teaching leadership, organizing, and civil society. And Marshall has literally changed the world in many venues through his organizing work, initially in the civil rights movement in the early 60s in Mississippi, then with the United Farm Workers for 16 years, where Marshall was really the right and left arms of Cesar Chavez, organizing the United Farm Workers. Then through many, many political campaigns. I know, Marshall, in reading books about you, Nancy Pelosi and Jerry Brown both attribute their initial wins to you and your field work. So that's pretty amazing. And then I knew you, and I think most people on this Zoom may know you through the Obama organizing manuals, which we've all been through. I know I was in a little group where I had to tell my story, and that was all you. And many people credit his initial wins to you. So no pressure. Marshall has 3 degrees from Harvard, but actually quite interesting. The first one took 28 years, which we'll talk about. But undergrad, MPA, which all the folks on this Zoom are getting, and a PhD, has also written some wonderful books. Most recently, I recommend his most recent book, Why David Sometimes Wins, which you can also listen to on Audible if you prefer that. So just a fabulous human being and a wonderful public servant. So thank you, Marshall. Let me turn to my questions of you. The first really I always ask, and that is, can you tell us what inspired you, if anything, originally to put you on this path way back?
Yeah, I have just first, thank you to fabulous Elizabeth, okay. And secondly, I really would appreciate if people would turn on their screens. You know, it's sort of seeing people and people seeing each other is really helpful in terms of getting a sense where everyone is and so forth. And it just, yeah, it's more alive. And I also usually ask, I guess it's, what is it? Good evening for most people? Is it
yes,
good evening?
Yes.
Yeah, well, how about, could you unmute and just respond? Let's just get something going here. So, good evening.
I think Mindy has to unmute you all.
Oh, Mindy,
I'm sorry, let's do that, but then we're going to mute everyone again.
All right, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. Hi.
Nice. That's
Mindy,
nice.
good evening from William Penhouse.
Good evening,
Marshall.
It's a nice harmonic. It's
Marshall,
nice.
Marshall, can we nudge your cows?
Uh-oh. I went too far, sorry.
Now I'm unmuted. All right. No, thanks. It's a nice harmonic with which to start. But Elizabeth, you asked me about original. Well, you know, it's it's a number of things, but I mean, the way I could, I think, best describe it is when I had volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project, which was an effort to support the work of African-American organizers in Mississippi in 1964, who were, being put in jail or beaten or worse, and because the law didn't protect them. And so the idea was to bring people to Mississippi who they might bring the law with them, white students from the North as well as Black students. And in that way, tried to bring some law and the project was organizing something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was a non-racist alternative to the Democratic Party, unofficial, to go to the Democratic Convention and to challenge the seating of the racist Democrats there, the official ones. And we were in Oxford, Ohio, where they were training us, and about 300 of us, and it was the night before it was time to go to Mississippi the next day. And we got word that 3 of our party had disappeared. Andrew Goodman, Michael Swerner, and James Chaney. They had gone to investigate the burning of a Black church where civil rights meetings had been going on in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and hadn't been heard from since. They had gone down a week earlier. Bob Moses, who we lost recently, who was the lead organizer, was a very soft-spoken guy, got us all together and up on the stage in this auditorium. He said, "We heard what happened to our brothers, and we don't know what happened, but we think they're gone." And sure enough, 2 months later, their bullet-riddled, beaten bodies were found buried in a dirt levee where the Ku Klux Klan had buried them after executing them when the county sheriff had turned them over to the Klan for that purpose. Now, we didn't know that, but we kind of knew that. And so Bob said, "Look, I'd like to tell everybody, just go home. You don't have to, there's no shame. But I have to ask you to go, but I can't take the whole responsibility." He said, "Everyone here needs to decide. And if you decide you can't go, that's fine, there's no shame." Well, I sank into my chair, just completely, the utter silence in the whole room. It's just like, whoa, is this what I signed up for? And you begin to ask yourself, then why are you here? Now, my father was a rabbi, my mother was a teacher. We lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War, when his work was largely with Holocaust survivors. And the Holocaust was a reality in our home. My grandmother's brother had been sent to Auschwitz, but a lot of his work was with survivors. My 5th birthday party was in a children's DP camps. They had displaced person camps. It was all children, which I thought was pretty cool. It was challenging that I was supposed to give gifts rather than get them. But then I understood why it was all children. The parents were gone. So the Holocaust in that sense was a reality in our home, but my parents interpreted it to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism, and that racism kills. And of course, the civil rights movement was challenging the institutionalized racism that's been a part of our country since before its founding. Now, I don't know if there's any PK. You know what a PK is? You know what a PK is? Anybody know what a PK is? Christian, you know what a PK is? Oh, can you?
Unfortunately, we're muted. They're muted, and I don't.
I don't know if it's the same context, but I know it as priest's kid.
Yeah. Often preacher's kid, because priest kid can be a little dubious under certain circumstances, but preacher's kids. Yeah, it's a thing. A rabbi's kid is the same thing. It's like, you got to go to all this stuff. You got to be at everything. And you're also supposed to be perfect, which is a different set of issues. But I did love the Passover Seder, which was the telling of the Exodus story, of that journey from slavery to freedom with food, which was kind of cool. But there was a point where they would point to the children and say, "You were slaves in Egypt." I said, "Wait, I've never been a slave, never been to Egypt." It took a while to understand what it meant was that that story is not the property of one people or place or time. It's told generation after generation, and you kind of have to figure out where you are in it. Are you with those folks with the chariots and the horses, or are you with the folks that are trying to find their way to a land of promise? Well, Dr. King interpreted the civil rights movement as another chapter of that story. And, I was 20 at the time. Others were 18, 19, 21. 22. The civil rights movement was a movement of young people. And there's a Protestant theologian, Walter Brueggemann, who wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination, where he says that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of two elements. One he calls criticality, a clear view of the world's hurt, of its pain, of its need, coupled with hope, a sense of its promise and possibilities. And young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, many do, but also almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. So there's a deep relationship between generation change and social change. It certainly was for my generation. I think it may be for this one as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we're sitting there in silence. And then a young woman named Jean Wheeler, a SNCC organizer, stands up in the back and she begins to sing. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've struggled so long, we must be free. They say freedom is a constant dying. We've died too long, we must be free. And as she stood up and began to walk out of the room, everybody followed in her. And the next day, everybody went to Mississippi. Now, for me, that was a turning point because it was in Mississippi I would discover what would be my calling really for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But that's gets at some of the motivations, Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
I hope.
Wow. I mean, Marshall, do you think it requires that kind of like horrifying and dramatic beginning to have put you where you are? I mean, do you think you might just have gone back to Harvard after that summer and, been a ho-hum one of the rest of us?
Well, I don't know. I think it's interesting about the horrifying part. And of course, I think the outrage with injustice, anger, I think can be a very positive emotion when it's outrage, like at what they're doing to kids, putting them in cages at the border and all. But then the question is what you do with that. And so the other element, though, is hopefulness, because outrage by itself or anger doesn't get you to where you can actually be motivated to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have to, my first SNCC staff meeting was in Gammon Theological Seminary in Atlanta. It was actually across from where we had the Camp Obama in Atlanta, that campaign. And I thought it's a SNCC staff meeting. And so it's going to be charts and maps and strategy. Well, they were having a preach-off. Now, I don't know if folks know what a preach-off is, but a preach-off was a competition to see who could imitate Dr. King better. And the celebratory, the joy in that, in the courage, wow, how could you not want to be part of that? It was like, yeah, I admire these people and I admire the courage. And yeah, I want to. So it's a different instinct than taking care of people who are suffering. It's more honoring people who are fighting to change the conditions of their suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. So Marshall, I know you talk about not going back to Harvard for 28 years after your second or third year, because you were a history major. And you said, I think to them, why would I study history when I can make history, which I just love. But tell me how you knew to go then. I mean, why did you go to the United Farm Workers? It's like you're a heat-seeking missile and you saw a possibility. Why did you do that next?
Well, I grew up from age 7 in Bakersfield here in California, where I am now. Not in Bakersfield, but in California. And Bakersfield's an oil and agriculture town at the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley, made infamous by John Steinbeck in Grapes of Wrath. It was the terminus of the Dust Bowl migration. And that's where I grew up. And so I came back to Bakersfield sort of thinking, well, maybe I'll go back to school eventually. And I met Cesar Chavez. And what it was that I'd grown up in the middle of the farm worker world, but I hadn't really seen it. I had to go to Mississippi and get what we call Mississippi Eyes to see yet another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections. And guess what? California, with its own rich history of racial discrimination going back to Native peoples, the Chinese, the Japanese, and so on and so forth, it turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America. It was an example of the America we needed to change. And that's what Cesar was up to. And I saw it in the form of organizing a union for farm workers. But it was in some ways just an extension of what we're doing in the South in important ways. And it turned out to be such a profound learning experience for me. I mean, where you can feel like you're living your values, you work with people you admire, and you can actually see change. Now, that doesn't mean that every day a new law gets passed, but it means every day a person finds courage that didn't have it. Every day a community finds the solidarity to support one another that didn't have it. Every day you see change in these micro ways. And what was appealing to me about organizing was it didn't end there, it only started there. Because then by people combining their efforts, you could build the power that you needed in order to change the institutions responsible for your challenges in the first place. And that's what was so appealing about that. And so we did community organizing, union organizing, workplaces. My first political campaign was Bobby Kennedy in '68. We did the Get Out the Vote in East Los Angeles, where we, non-citizens, about 150 farm workers, went to turn out the vote of Latino citizens in that primary election. We had amazing turnouts, 87% East Los Angeles precincts. It's unbelievable. But of course, we lost him later that night. We did boycott organizing. I was sent to Canada to get Canadians to stop eating grapes, which was a really interesting kind of experience, Toronto and Montreal. But it was a school for learning a craft, not just like, hey, be one with the people, but learning that mobilizing people to act collectively is a craft. And there are skills, and there are relational skills and narrative skills and strategic skills and structural skills and action skills. And that was just so rich. I guess the last thing I'll say about it was that the core constituency were Mexican immigrants. And so the core cultural framework was Mexican and Mexican Catholic, just as in the South, the core cultural framework had been that of the Black church. But organizing a union, it couldn't be exclusively that, because the Filipino farm workers played an important role. Punjabis, Azore Islanders, the California agriculture is like an ethnic mosaic, both on the grower side and the worker side. And, people don't realize, but the first farm worker who was killed on a farm worker picket line in California in 1973 was a young man named Naji Daifullah, who was from Yemen and part of a group of Yemeni farm workers that had been brought to work in the grapes during the strike. And he had been beaten to death by a Kern County deputy sheriff. The first farm worker funeral that was held like that was a Muslim funeral with about 8,000 Mexican farm workers and an imam. And the cultural, understanding culture as a source of richness and courage and solidarity, but not in an exclusive way. That was an incredibly important lesson to learn there. And Caesar was really good at that.
So Marshall, no pressure, but you've got a recipe here that's pretty damned effective in a lot of different places, a lot of different geographies and decades. We've got a really tough time in the country now. And I wonder, where your next thing is going to be. I mean, what can you do with your organizing model, which is so effective, to fix some things now?
Well, I think we're all I think a lot of us are trying to figure that out. Now, we had a wonderful session here at Stanford yesterday, online, actually. And I say the most refreshing voices were those of the students, who have a stake. It's their future. And, there's a hunger to learn how to get it. Now, learning how to do this stuff, though, is like learning to ride a bicycle. You don't read a book about it. You have to get on the bike, and what happens when you get on the bike? First thing, you fall. That's your moment of truth. You go home, go to bed, or you find the courage to get back up, knowing that you're going to keep falling until you learn to keep your balance. And in my experience, that's how you learn any practice. You don't learn to build relationships by reading about them. You build relationships. So in this context, there are important sources of energy all over the place. And, whether it's folks I work with in Sunrise, the young people involved there, the whole struggle for Black liberation that covers so many different fronts, the issues around energy and the climate crisis, gender struggles of all kinds. The challenge has been, and I think is, to bring that together in a coherent picture enough so that there is the strength to really rebirth our democracy, because that's what's at stake right now. And I think people really need to recognize that. There are authoritarian forces, and see, the reality is that our country has never been a representative democracy. You know, the representation has always been deeply skewed, and it remains that way today. You take a look at the Senate. You know, somebody's vote in Wyoming is 64 times the worth of one vote in California. It has nothing to do with democratic representation or equal voice. So I think there's a challenge here to kind of reclaim the democratic project. Often you say democracy, well, what is that? Well, it really comes down to, from my perspective, a fundamental question of persons, a question of persons' dignity, of their worth, of their entitlement to agency, of their value, of what we owe one another. Now, if you start with a foundation there and then you imagine how can we create a mechanism of governance, you get to democracy. On the other hand, when you choose other pathways, it usually winds up negating equal worth, equal value. And so in our country, democracy has been much more of an aspiration than that which has been realized. And so in a sense, Elizabeth, I think the answer to the question is really everyone that's present here and all of us, because democracy is not something you have, it's something you do. It's a practice, and it's not static. And either we are going to be part of, you know, the theme for the talk last night, are we busy being born, or are we busy dying? Are we busy rebirthing our democracy, or are we simply presiding over its demise? And I think that's the kind of choices we have to make. The energy, just this last thing about this is the energy on the right manifest in the mobilizing around local school boards, around local offices of all kinds, around local election officials. That comes out of a movement of deep conviction. Now, it may be wrong-headed conviction, but where's the same momentum, energy from those who love democracy and want to rebirth it? That's the missing piece, I think. Sometimes there's so much fragmentation over issues. You know, I want to save the trees. No, I want to save the fish. Oh, well, we can't be in the same organization because we have two different identities. You're a tree person, I'm a fish person. It's nonsense, because we're not doing the work to get at the core values underneath that can unify us. And that's where I think the real challenge is right now. And I think we figure this out by figuring it out. We just have to engage with it. And I'm hoping that some of the folks here want to engage.
Well, they do, and they will. So you taught me, and I think a lot of us, that grassroots organizing and field work is really where it's at. And you kind of just implied that. And many people have thought, oh, you know, it's not for the intellectual, it's not for the sophisticated, but it's where it gets done. So thank you for organizing us. On that topic generally of polarization, you know, a lot of people, in fact, most of us think, oh my God, you know, this polarization in the country is a terrible thing. But I know you've said that contentiousness is what democracy is about, that we need to be polarized to mobilize. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's hopeful.
Yeah, I think, no, it's interesting. Yeah, Linsky, the community organizer, said that organizers have to be well-integrated schizoids because you have to polarize to mobilize and depolarize to settle anything. And there's a certain kind of truth to that. But in terms of what's happening in our country, I don't know that I would describe it as polarization. I know that's often used, but polarization suggests symmetry, and I don't think there is a symmetry. I think there's a profound asymmetry. I think there is profound polarization on the right. I think we've seen the Republican Party become more and more and more polarized around a very core set. I don't think that's comparable for those who are not in that grouping. I think it's much broader. There's much more diversity. And the problem, it seems to me, is fragmentation rather than polarization. And so I think, part of the phenomenon of polarization is a function of another one of those problems in our electoral system, which is the single member district. When you have a single member district, 51% gets 100% of the representation, 49% gets nothing. Now, if you had legislative districts that were based on proportionality or multi-member districts, we would have a much fuller range of political alternatives, but we don't. It's not just like third parties fail because they're third parties. It's built right into the structure of our system. We lost Lonnie Guinier last week, who was a pioneer in recognizing this problem way back when she was nominated for Deputy Attorney General by Bill Clinton, who later rescinded the nomination, unfortunately, at that time. So the binary nature of our politics has a lot to do with just the way we're structured. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I sort of saying what I was trying to get at before, which is there's a broad range of those who are not aligned with the radical authoritarian right. We got to get our act together. Mm-hmm. And I mean, to me, that's kind of where the challenge is. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, people talk about the radical left. Where's the radical left in this country? I can't find it. I mean, I don't know. It's just not comparable.
If you can't find it in Harvard Square, it probably doesn't exist. Cambridge Mass phone book.
Well, and it doesn't hold any congressional seats, and it doesn't hold any governorships, and it doesn't hold any positions of public trust. That's a little different kind of symmetry. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. So, Marshall, what movements do you see now that are working? I mean, what movements can we all jump on board, or should we all, initiate?
I think it's a work in progress right now. I think, and I think the struggle to it's so sad, the struggle to defend voting. Mm-hmm. The struggle should be to expand voting. The struggle should be to go from one person, one voice to one voice, one person, one vote to one vote, one voice. We should be equalizing the voice and all that. But we're stuck in this place where we're trying to just hang on. Mm-hmm. Now, that's got to be turned around. That's really just so fundamental. And when you talk about those things, people say, oh, that's a procedural. No, it's not about procedure. It's about power. It's actually about who governs. Mm-hmm. And who governs, Sid Verba, the political scientist for many years, said that liberal democracy is an experiment as to whether equality of voice based on citizenship can balance the power of resources based on ownership. In other words, is it possible to have a system which values inequality and equality with respect to resources, but equality with respect to politics, to voice? That's really what it is. And that's one of the reasons we're struggling so much. And one of the reasons there's so much imbalance is that we don't have equal voice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we need that. Yeah. Whether it's voting or whether it's around schools, or there's so much that needs to happen.
Okay, Marshall, last question from me before we turn it over to all the folks here. So, you're so inspiring to us, but you're almost overwhelmingly intimidating because it looks like you've had success. I know, success, mountaintop. No. But you talked about falling off a bicycle. Have you fallen off bicycles? Like, were you ever in the wilderness, as you say, or you just are incredibly successful forever?
Yeah, let me just show you the scars from the various falls off bicycle. No, I mean, yeah, of course. And, going to Mississippi was, you know, here I'm a Jewish white guy from Harvard, and I'm going to work in the Black community in Mississippi. That's an interesting situation. I had wonderful mentors, young men, Hollis Watkins, 2 years older than me, 31 years older than me in organizing years. I also had E.W. Steptoe, who was 52, one of these very brave people who'd been head of an NAACP chapter in Southwest Mississippi, who I lived with for 8 months. They were coaches. And so my screw ups, you know, I was told that the core thing you had to learn was about respect. I said, well, I respect people. No, I was told, no, you do a lot of listening, but hear what's being said. Ask questions, but learn from them. And give respect and you'll get it. Mm-hmm. And finally, never try to be anything you're not. Well, you know, that served me well. Look, I mean, I can't tell you how many elections we've lost organizing farm workers, political elections that we've lost, but personal disappointments, being given far too much responsibility than I could handle and having to just like check out and figure out how to come back in and rebuild my own confidence has happened several times. Leaving the farm workers in 1981, which was not a happy leaving, and then taking 10 years to figure out what would click next. And that's when I did a lot of electoral organizing, and so political consulting wasn't for me. And it wasn't until I came back to my 25th reunion here at Harvard, having not graduated, as Elizabeth pointed out, that something clicked. It was like 20-year-old me said, I'm saying, I got to go deeper, broader in what I've been doing. I'm feeling stuck. I've just been working with Jerry Brown trying to reinvent the Democratic Party in California, which was, I'm feeling kind of stuck. So 20-year-old me said, well, why don't you come back? And you know, I had issues, I don't know, my synapses, I don't know, tuition had changed a little bit, you know, in the interim. But when I did come back and finish that senior year, it really clicked. It was like pushing reset. Mm-hmm. And it was like pushing the reset and discovering a whole new venue in which I could do the same thing I was doing before, which was recruiting, identifying, developing leadership, building community around leadership, building power. I just do it now in a different context and different venue. It took me 10 years for that. So this is not, there's nothing linear about life, folks. You know, it's zigs and zags. And it's sort of figuring out what it is that really calls you. If you resist that because you have a lot of shoulds in your head, you're making a big mistake. And I don't like to give advice, but when you choose that which really calls you, you're going to be good at it. And that will attract support and open doors you can't even imagine. So unless you take the risks of falling off the bicycle, because you don't have a perfect plan, you're never going to learn how to ride it. You'll just struggle from bike to bike.
That's fabulous. We're going to have to remember that. Well, also, Marshall, I didn't mention that you're now changing the world globally, because I know you're teaching and online has been a huge thing for you. I know in India and all over Asia and Latin America and Israel. So thank you for all the dominoes and the ripples that you're creating.
One of the really exciting things is, well, at the Kennedy School, you do have students from all over the world. It is one of the real blessings of that place, because you can't then learn in a sort of completely US-centric context. You have to learn in a broader context. It's important for Americans to learn in a broader context. And the distance learning, I've been doing distance learning class and organizing for 10 years now. And we have usually 130 students from about 25 countries. And so rich, because we're then able to work with people in those countries to develop their own capacity and their own ways of teaching and leadership development. Probably our most successful work has been in the Arab Middle East, rooted in Amman, Jordan, where we actually now, my colleague there, Nisreen Haj Ahmed, does her own distance learning class modeled on ours in Arabic, reaching 11 countries. And so this whole international stuff, boy, is it sort of the core way we introduce the work I do is through narrative and working in public narrative. And when you understand about stories, everybody tells stories, everybody. And so when you start with stories, you start rooted in people's own culture, own identity, own self-understanding. And the learning then, it's not like following a blueprint. It's much more like a roadmap to find resources within one's own world that can enable one to advance values of agency and so forth. So the international stuff has been so rich. From Japan, where people said, no, it's never going to work here, for about 5 minutes, didn't work. But I don't want to dismiss that. The other thing that's so cool is how people adapt basic frameworks, basic things culturally. It's really interesting. And so that whole international thing has been just a real
wonderful. And the internet. Okay, great.
Yeah,
well,
internet.
thank you for that first half. And so Mindy, why don't you take over with the questions?
Thanks so much. We have a lot of really wonderful questions. Thank you for everyone who's sending them. Keep on sending them and we'll get to as many as we can. So for our first question, we have Ayo Al-Dasani, who is an MPA and Master of Law student here at Penn.
Hi, Mr. Ganz. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hi.
Yeah, it's really great to.
I was just looking for you. I see you. Hi.
Hi. So my question is basically, over the course of a career that you want focused on change making, what are the best ways to balance a focus on people and individual stories, and also balance that with focus on institutions and practices and processes, because they sometimes feel at odds with each other, and it sometimes feels like they're incomplete without each other. So wondering, again, over the course of a career, how to balance those two things.
It's a great question. And it's really what attracted me to organizing in the South in the first place, because it was about working with people, individuals, as they're in a developmental way. In other words, finding their own sources of courage, their own sources of solidarity, and very developmental in that sense, learning, growth, development at an individual level and community level. But it was then people coming together to develop the power they needed to change institutions. And so it was not like getting stuck up here in the institutional stratosphere where we're just talking about stuff. It's also not disappearing into, oh, well, just, do this one thing and that'll change the world. Well, yeah, fine. But it's got to add up. And to me, the translation medium is power, and it's organizational power. And by power, I say power, people say, oh, that's just terrible, scary power. In Spanish, the word is poder. It just means to be able to. And it's very intuitive. If you need what I have more than I need what you have, who's got the power? If you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? Come on, point at me or point at yourselves. You need what I've got more than I need what you've got. Who's got the power? Yeah, I do. You reverse it, okay? Because power is not a thing, it's a relationship. It is a relationship between need and resource, and that's really important. Now, when people have common needs, they can combine their resources to create greater capacity, like a cooperative. But when we have conflicts of interest, where your benefit is my loss, then we have to figure out what the resources are that we can combine in order to rebalance the scales. And for us, the great example was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, where people discovered it started the modern civil rights movement. I'm sure everybody's heard of Rosa Parks, not a lady who one day just got tired, but it was a strategy. She was secretary of the NAACP chapter to challenge segregated buses in Birmingham, in Montgomery, Alabama. And originally they were going to file a lawsuit, but what they discovered was that they had a powerful resource they just didn't know they had, which was their feet. And if they used their feet to walk to work and did it as a community, as opposed to using their feet to get on the bus and give the bus company their bus fare, then they could turn their dependency on the bus company and the bus company's dependency on them individual dependency could be turned into collective power. And that's sort of the basic term of equation. In union organizing, with farm workers, same thing, political organizing. So it's enabling people to find the resources that they have that they can then turn into sources of power that they need to get what they want. I mean, the American colonists in the Northeast, I mean, they started with, that Boston Harbor thing. That was a boycott. They were boycotting tea. It was a simple thing, widely accessible, and it put economic pressure on the tea industry and on the British government. And also they became Americans because they wouldn't drink tea, they were drinking coffee. So that was kind of an identity, a little deal here. Gandhi did this with salt. It requires creativity, and it requires creativity in understanding the interdependencies that exist. And collective power then can balance a whole lot. And that's kind of what organizing said. It's what democracy is meant to be, to say that, de Tocqueville says, like in a democracy, the knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all forms of knowledge, because combining equal voices, then you create a system in which people govern, majorities govern. And so that's a long answer to your question, but see, to me, that's how you make the connection. And it's there to be made. And it's a big mistake to start at just one end or the other end. It doesn't have the same meaning. You can do good work, but it doesn't really shift things. Io, does that make sense?
Great. Oh, sorry, he can't unmute. I'm gonna, because we've got a ton of questions, we are gonna continue on if that's all right.
Okay, I just wanted to check it. All right, I got thumbs up.
You got a thumbs up, great.
Okay, cool.
Our next question is from Megan Blickman, who is a alum of Fels Institute of Government.
Hi, Mr. Ganz. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I have been your biggest fan since 2010 when I accidentally got on a plane to Arizona to organize against SB 1070. So I've been 11 years in the making. I'm also,
hi, Megan. Nice
hi. I'm also an alum of President Obama's 2012 campaign, and just feel so lucky now to be with you. But my question's a little bit different. It has to do specifically with campaign organizing. So I think in the wake of 2016 and 2020, several presidential campaigns, field organizers established unions, which is excellent, but it also forced a reckoning of strategy about hiring and running programs that we typically hadn't had to deal with in the past. And organizing is, in campaigns at least, is not particularly inclusive. People are frequently not hired from the places where they're working. It's extremely long hours. It's, you just give everything to a campaign. But when organizers unionized, we were suddenly forced to reconfigure hours and vacation. And, suddenly even on election day, folks can't work, from sun up to sundown, which is fine, but it did force a reckoning. And so I'm interested to hear from you how you think we can make field organizing, particularly in presidential campaigns, but even outside of, particularly electoral campaigns and even outside of them, more sustainable and inclusive to make sure that excellent people keep doing it?
Boy, well, it's a big question. And I think the first question is, what is the place of organizing in electoral campaigns? Usually it's the stepchild, right? Usually it's the secondary thing. There's unlimited budgets for the advertising, for the, it was $15 billion in 2020. And it fuels a whole industry of political, we're unique among liberal democracies to have no constraints on campaign spending. See, and that goes back to the Supreme Court Buckley v. Vallejo decision in 1972 that money is speech. Now, what that did is create a whole industry here, unlike other places, that's a political marketing industry. And the more money that's spent, the more money the people spending it make. And so it takes the whole electoral process, monetizes it, and turns it into a form of marketing. Now, in that context, where do organizers come into the picture? And so I think you have to start with the valuing. And see, if volunteer effort is not valued, then people quickly become just used as props, or it's not a real thing. So I think part of the question is, Well, and the other thing is that very few campaigns have any interest in sustaining organization after the campaign. They just sort of want to have people go turn out the vote in a tight election or whatever, and then and then disappear. It's like migrant workers, like seasonal labor. Well, see, that power ought to be in the hands of civic organizations. That would be a political party if we're another country, but we don't have parties like that here. And so I think one of the real challenges is sustained political oriented organization. One of the problems is that so much work, advocacy work, has been consigned to the nonprofit world for financial reasons, and then therefore can't be political. So we've taken a whole domain of advocacy and public work and put it in a domain where it can't be partisan. Boy, if I wanted to insulate myself against challenge, boy, that's something I would do. The whole 501c3 has a very, very other side to the story, which is to depoliticize what needs to be political, because that's our system. That's how we can exercise democracy, is through political mechanisms. We get out of the political fray. Well, it's a nice thing, but it isn't the same thing. There's a very terrific history by Dan Schlossman, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, called When Movements Anchor Parties, that explores the relationship between movement building and party organization in the US. And so often the energy and push for change that comes from the outside, not from the inside. And so I guess the way I'm trying to answer your question is that one is to understand what the role of organizing, of bringing people together. If you think politics is about bringing people together to engage with one another, to learn with one another, what de Tocqueville described as learning enlightened self-interest as common interest. But we have a system that does just the opposite. It fragments, it divides people into these little units. I was part of pioneering efforts here in California in the 80s, fragmented targeting, where you have left-handed whatevers, and so it's this process of fragmentation rather than of coming together. It's like a disaggregation, and so we need organizations to do this, or we need to transform the way we do campaigns pretty profound. Now, I think there's a lot more opportunity for that at the local level and even at the state level. And I think that the 15 billion number I cited was just on federal campaigns. That didn't include state and local campaigns. There are opportunities there, I think, to build a real grassroots base. In the last 4 years, I've been doing work with mayors through the Bloomberg Project at Harvard. We've been training 40 mayors a year, and I've been training them in public narrative and how to tell your story of us, your story of self, your story of now. And I've really been impressed with the people who are in those positions. Now, see, unlike legislators, they can't run off and go sit in the seat somewhere. They got to actually confront the people that chose them, and they have to make things work. It's a very important tier and level of leadership and organization. So all I'm saying is let's broaden this a little bit, and let's try to go there. Yes, of course, everyone deserves fair working conditions. Everybody does. It's based on the recognition of the dignity of the work they're doing. And, you take a look at essential workers right now. I mean, Jesus, and one thing COVID did was, boy, it sure brought all the inequalities right to the surface. I mean, you could see everything. Now, what do we do about that? So organizers too, but it's within the constraint of what you're doing. I don't know, I haven't been in the Navy, but I've been told that on ships, they have battle stations and regular assignment. And I think of campaigning as battle stations and regular assignment as the continuity of the work sustaining the organization. And I think they're two different rhythms. And I think it's important to understand the rhythm of continuity and understand the rhythm of change. And the rhythm of change is intense, it's episodic, and it's the kind of work we do in campaigns. And we have to be realistic about that in doing what we're sure people to assure people proper working conditions and proper recognition for their labor. It's a long answer to your question, Megan. I think it's a good question because it opens up a whole other set of concerns. Thanks for that.
Thanks. For our next question, we have Jaden Kolduck, who is an undergrad at Penn, class of 2022.
All right. Where's Jaden?
Please comment.
Mr. Ganz,
Hi, how are you?
doing well, you?
All right, good, thanks.
Great. So how would you motivate people to defend and reform the American federal government? I guess what story would you want to tell to motivate people to support voting rights?
It's great, good question. I'd ask you, what would you say? I'll respond, but I'm curious, what would you say? No pressure.
Yeah. Well, I think with to motivate anyone, you have to motivate their self-interest. Okay, why does voting matter to me? Especially, you probably have to motivate people who think their vote doesn't matter. People who are from a minority party in a state that votes one way. I think that it can't be a left-right issue, because if you make voting rights say a Democratic issue, then how are you going to get any swing voters or Republicans on board? So it's like the Voting Rights Act used to be like a bipartisan thing that people used to approve. But now it's become partisan. So how can we associate kind of what you're saying is that earlier, that voting rights is really about making sure everyone has a voice, but not just a voice, but an equal voice.
Yeah, exactly.
I probably would start there.
I think starting with the premise of everyone should have an equal voice is a really good premise. But you would run into, that would be contested. It would be contested by people who think everyone should not have an equal voice, that their voice should be more equal than another person's voice. And we have some fundamental divisions in the country about that. And you know, it's kind of like, to have a polity of any kind, you have to have enough common commitment to common values, enough that there's a foundation. Like, do we believe in the equal worth of each person or don't we? I mean, and that's pretty fundamental. I also think it's important to distinguish between being nonpartisan and being, how can I put it, being neutral with respect to partisan and being neutral with respect to politics. In other words, I think political neutrality is problematic because, you know, politics are an expression of values. You know, we don't all have the same values. We need to have enough core values that we can argue and not try to destroy one another. I mean, and that's one of the problems we have going on right now. But, you know, it is about engagement and it is about learning and all that sort of thing. So political neutrality to me doesn't make any sense. Partisan, given the way the parties operate, it's really messed up. I mean, it's very problematic for that reason. There's certainly moral equality is not moral neutrality is certainly not acceptable. So I think the question of taking values seriously is really important and not trying to muddy that up in on the one hand, on the other hand, you know, this side, that side, and create these false symmetries, you know. But I think for me, it has to go back to the basic worth of a human being and what a system of political governance can look like. See, I think there's been so much emphasis on government being dysfunctional as as providing services and all that. But what has not been contested is how unrepresentative government is. And the challenge here, I think, is to make our government genuinely representative. Now, that's a pretty abstract thing. That's got to be made very concrete and very real when it gets down to why you should vote, because as you say, the logic might be, I'm in California, why should I vote in a primary? I mean, why should I vote in a general? It doesn't make any sense. That's a reflection of having an electoral college, which makes no sense.
Mhm.
And so there are these institutional reforms to enhance the democracy that I think really matter.
Marshall, I can just add one quick thing there.
There's more to this, but like yeah.
Sorry, can
Yes,
I?
and Jen, I appreciate, yeah, I was just gonna say, I appreciate the question. It's a longer conversation, but really appreciate it. Yeah, Elizabeth.
No, it's a wonderful question. Just to be really granular and practical, we have had, actually, Elsa, who you know, Schaefer, spoke about her wonderful organization, Reclaim Our Vote. And there are a couple of others, Center for Common Ground, Fair Fight, which are incredibly effective. And I believe brought home Georgia, the 2 Georgia races, not to be partisan, but I am, in January, because as you know, in fact, 300 or 400 postcards were written by this group on the Zoom here today for Reclaim Our Vote into Georgia. And as you know, I think they don't actually say vote Republican, vote Democrat. They say vote, and here's your voting address. And here's early voting dates. And so that's at least a very, very granular, practical way to get out the vote.
And I think coupled with the organizational efforts in Georgia that Stacey Abrams has been leading for a number of years, it adds up. In other words, there's been a long-term investment in developing political capital at the grassroots, and then adding to that the mobilizing of particular resources, then you get somewhere.
Right.
But if you're just doing the mobilizing but not doing the organizing, it's very thin. And I think Georgia is actually a wonderful example of that.
Yeah, and all of those groups have wonderful websites, so you can all go volunteer and do postcards, do phone banking, and it does make a difference. Okay, Mindy.
All right, I know we're getting close to our time, but
Yeah, hang on. Yeah, actually, Marshall, can we go over, please? Can we go over our 7 o'clock?
Yeah, it's fine with me. I'm good.
You're okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
We could probably
fine.
keep you all night with all of these questions.
Oh, good.
But we will let you
Oh,
go.
good.
I
All
promise.
right. All
It's
right.
good. No, it's
Our
good
next-
weather. It's good weather out here. So yeah.
Thank you.
Next question is from John Henry, who is an MTA student at Fels in the class of 2022.
Where are you?
Hi, Mr. Ganz. Thank you for talking with us. We've had a lot of very phenomenal speakers, but you've been the most captivating storyteller. So thank you for sharing some of your experiences with us.
John Henry, you have a famous name too.
Thank you. You've talked about how you've been part of decades of movements dating all the way back to the civil rights movement. And there have been countless advancements that could make mobilization easier in those subsequent decades. But what's one challenge that you think's emerged that previous movements may not have had to encounter, like a challenge that makes it harder to mobilize in today's day and age?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that's really interesting. I think that you can't assume relational context in the way that I think you could have at one time in terms of the relational networks within which people live and operate. I think it's been more thinned out, so to speak, which means you have a lot more relational work to do at a fundamental level. And by relational work, I mean the building of civic relationships. I'm not talking so much about intimate relationships or kinship, but rather relationships around commitment to common purpose or commitment to a shared organizational thing or that kind of thing. I think that may have gotten. On the other hand, there's more fluidity, which also opens up possibilities. I think the money thing is a major issue. And like I was describing, the way in which it's monetized the electoral process makes it a lot harder to influence the electoral process. And you can, but it is more challenging. But I don't know, it's an interesting thing to think about because, we tend to think, oh, the old days, everything was, it's not like that. And I think we have new challenges like the whole digital revolution, but they also create new opportunities. Before direct mail, the way most national organizations generated funds was through local organization, because local organization would collect dues and send it per capita up to the state and then to the national, and that's it. Once direct mail came along, it didn't have to do that anymore. You could go directly to individuals. You could bypass all that. And so the need for local organization disappeared for a whole bunch of organizations. And so then it got very professionalized, very much located in DC. And what do we need local groups for? You know, we don't need them to raise money. Now, if you think you need local groups in order to generate power politically, well, then you'll have them. If you don't. So I think there's the shifting of scale, of information access and overload, all of that is challenging. But, you know, it was challenging back then to deal with a lot of the constraints and limitations that existed. I was, you know, think about 1848 in Europe, you know, revolution spread from one country to another very quickly, mainly through people on horseback with leaflets. And so it doesn't take the internet to have things spread fast, but it's different. And so we're all learning. I don't know if this gets to your point, John, but I think we're always learning and have to be if we're going to be, you know, engaged.
Thanks so much. For our next question, we have Ayinde Merrill, who is also a Fels MPA student in the class of 2022.
Where are you? I don't see you.
We're coming. Here we go. You there, Ayinde?
Yeah, can you hear me?
There we go.
Yeah, so my question is more on a global scale. So some sectors of the teachings of the Black radical tradition of resistance emphasizes the idea of Pan-African cooperation. Do you believe it is feasible for there to be a global coalition of grassroots organizations to collectively fight and power bill to end racism, fascism, imperialism, etc.? I think we saw some of that, like we saw some acts of solidarity in the protests in summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, where there's so many different countries having protests. But do you believe it can advance past acts of solidarity into possibly long-term cooperation and mutual aid?
I mean, I don't mean I would throw the question back only in this sense. Why not? I mean, in other words, I think one of the things, like I was saying, that impressed me about the international stuff that I've had a chance to do is what's possible now in ways that wasn't before. Now, you know, there have been major international change organizations. You know, the anti-slavery movement was one, you know, back in the 18th, 19th century, rather. The socialist movement was very international. The Catholic Church, very international. I mean, there have been precedents. Now it's a whole lot, I want to say, easier in the sense that the communication, the cost is reduced. There's much, facilitation of shared understanding. Of course, at the same time, contexts differ locally. And so then the question is, how do you connect difference in local context with a broader set of objectives and strategic objectives? Generally in strategy, the challenge is that from the mountaintop, things look different than they do from the valley. And in the valley, you know what's happening in the valley. But up on the mountaintop, you can see what's happening in that valley related to all the other valleys. And so you really need both. You need the mountaintop and you need the local context. Now, if you can turn that into a venue for strategizing, it can be powerful, very powerful, into a venue in which there's mutual learning, not just like, you know, where you do enough work to identify what the common threads are, so that definition is not solely by difference, but rather by, okay, this is what we're trying to do together. And no, I think it has a lot of potential. I think it ought to. You know, capital flows around just like all at once. Why can't organization? Why can't people these days? And no, I wish you well with it.
So much. For our next question, we have Rachel Griffith, who is a 2019 Fels alum.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Dr. Ganz. Thanks for being with us tonight. My question is sort of, I guess, along the same vein of John's question previously, who was talking about challenges. to organizing in this sort of the modern world. And I'm wondering in particular about social media and what role that has played, for better or for worse, in organizing, because it feels like, you know, so many people's relationships and communities with one another are through digital means these days. And like that, to me, I feel like that takes a little bit of the power out of the relationships and a little bit of the personalness. But I'm wondering what your perception of it has been in organizing, whether it's a positive or negative or both, or, you know, if there's, just like everything, there's a good way to use it and a not good way.
Yeah, I suspect that your last sort of sums it up. I mean, it is here, it is there. And so now what do we do with it? What do we make of it? How do we make it useful? You know, unfortunately, in our system, the first use test tends to be how to make it profitable. And that often runs contrary to uses that could make it more educational, could make it more health giving, could make it all the rest of it. And so I think that's sort of one of the questions. Now, look, I've been using Zoom for a long time, and I only wish I'd bought stock in it, but you know, that's the past. But I think that all of a sudden everybody became Zoom literate. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. And a lot of our capacity to sustain face-to-face relationships were in this way, the way we're talking right now. And I think we learned to do a lot. See, for me, the visual made a huge difference. I mean, I used to die in the black hole of conference calls, you know, where nobody was ever listening anyway, and people, you know, but now you have to, hey, turn on your screens, you know, it's kind of like, yeah, what are you really doing? But it's, now it really, I think, broadened our capacity and our access in some really interesting and exciting ways. Now, building a relationship, though, what does it take to build a relationship? What is a relationship? You know, is it just like, hi? You know, do you build relationships out of commonality or out of difference? Well, often out of difference, because otherwise there's no motivation to enter into the relationship. On the other hand, unless there's commitment to continuing the relation, there's no relationship. Because without a commitment, without a committed relation, there's no future. It's just an exchange, it's a transaction. Now, it's very easy through this medium to be very transactional, but it doesn't mean you have to be transactional. Because like I say, the difference between an exchange and a relationship is commitment. Is like committing our time, our skill, our caring, whatever it might be, but being very clear about the power of commitment. And see, where I think a lot of mistakes are made is like just thinking, well, somebody clicks and they clicked. That's not a commitment. And we make commitments. The most important commitments we make are to each other. See, that in all the use of digital media to mobilize individuals, that was missing. And so you get these big mobilizations and then nothing lasts. You know, I spent some time with Wael Ghonim, the Google guy in Tahrir Square, you know, who did a great job of mobilizing to get rid of Mubarak, but they didn't organize. They didn't build the commitments, the structure. So those that had the structure went away with the goodies. I mean, it was originally the Muslim Brothers, and then it was the military. So I guess what I'm saying is building relationships doesn't depend so much on the medium. We do need to be able to see one another, I think. On the other hand, people built relationships through this thing called writing letters, you know, that used to exist. And I think they had things called pen pals, which was like a sort of, you know, ancient concept. So look, I just think that it's how do we humanize this stuff and not let it dehumanize us. We're doing a project with interesting biological scientists. It's a movement of they think of community labs based in MIT. And it's a global movement. It's really interesting people to work with because they're into growing things, not just building things. It's kind of an interesting thing. And they want us to help them come up with shared purpose for their movement. So they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll have surveys, and then the algorithm will process the surveys, and then we'll know what our shared purpose is. And I said, well, then you'll know the shared purpose of the algorithm, but you won't know your people's shared purpose because the people have to engage with each other in doing the work of constructing a shared purpose if it's to be a shared purpose. And that's what they did. And it turned out pretty cool. And we used the digital for sharing information, but not pretending that that's the same thing as shared learning or as commitment to one another. So I just think, Rachel, being really clear about what it is to have to create human value and then harness this stuff to that, as opposed to letting it be imposed on us. And that's a lot of what's happened. You know, you get turned into a data point, you get turned into, you know, a stereotype, you get turned into a brand, you get turned into there's all these forces of objectification, commodification. And we have to resist that. I don't know. I think there's a lot of opportunity. Does it make sense to you? She's muted, yeah. No, so much of this, what's so weird about so much of this goes back to just rediscovering what it is to be a human being and what it is that being a full human being, how much that is. That is a lot. And we're not reducible to one category or one stereotype, or we're not, you know, because we're thinking, feeling creatures and we're capable of relationship and growth and learning. And I think we have to keep focused on that. We're not just profit centers and we're not just data points.
Wonderful. Okay,
Thanks so much.
Mindy.
All right, I think I'm getting the word that we have time for one or maybe two more, we'll see. But our next question is from Mike Holt, who is an alum of the Fels MPA program. Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Hey, I just wanted to say first, like Megan, I've been a longtime fan. I actually did a lot of labor organizing before coming to Fels and had done a training institute in Texas, totally based around public narrative. And so I've been a big fan for a long time. So it's an honor to be here with you. But I was just going to ask, looking at the political landscape right now, especially on the left, it just feels in many ways like we have leadership who are older and who are, great, but in many ways seem to be disconnected from a lot of the energy among young movements. And we've seen, movements like Black Lives Matter or the progressive movement or, recent unionization efforts. But it feels like in many ways, political leadership is somewhat disconnected from that. And so I was just curious if you've seen any kind of younger leaders, either, political leaders or movement leaders who you feel kind of are positioned in a way to harness the future and the next generation of leadership in a way that they could, grasp grassroots organizing and mobilize that into policies.
Well, what's the first thing you're going to run for?
Oh, not me anytime soon.
No, come on. But I mean, really, that's not a question to ask me. It's a question to ask your peers. I mean, really, I don't mean to be flippant about it. I mean, I think it's a really important question. It is one reason that that I'm doing work with Sunrise and trying to support their turning from mobilization to organization. In other words, how to make the most of their enthusiasm by organizing it in a way. And it's really fascinating. We just had a little session this morning about this. But, who's out there? I mean, of course, AOC, was like blew everybody's mind, oh my God, where did this person come from? It's generational change that needs to happen, but it's got to be driven by your generation. And it needs to happen. I mean, that's the mechanism of renewal. And, you were being very tactful about saying, well, older or whatever. Yeah, okay, fine, that's fine. There's a saying, a Spanish saying, Mexican saying, hay que ser como el vino, entre más viejo, más bueno. The important thing is to be like wine, the older, the better. So, that's fine. And I do think that there is a real opportunity for cross-generational conversation that could be much richer than it is, much richer. It's one reason I love teaching. I mean, I get to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. I mean, that's really what's happening. And it's a real privilege. It's a gift. So I want to throw the question back to you. I mean, where's the leadership going to come from? You know, and if the thing is politics are dirty, well, you know, yeah, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, and I think there is the gender shifts in representation are really important. I think they're really important, and that's significant. And in 2018, there was a big shift in Congress that was really, I think, important. It just includes more voices, it's broader. So, yeah, I don't know. I think colleges and universities like where I am here need to do a far better job of equipping people with respect for their own values and how to translate those values into action as opposed to fitting into the next consulting gig or whatever the next thing is. You know what? I mean, here at Stanford, where I am right now, you know, they start recruiting freshman year and the compensations are huge. I don't know what it's like at Wharton or wherever, but, you know, it's like all of us just need to do a much better job of this. Religious institutions can sometimes play a role. It depends on how relevant they are. You know, the current Pope, I think, is pretty cool. You know, there's, so I'm not trying to avoid the question. I just think that you have the answer. I don't.
No pressure.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much. Our next question, I think this might be the last question, is from Grant Holland, who is an MPA student at Fels. He is calling from work and does not have his camera or microphone, so he's just listening in. So I'm going to read the question on his behalf.
Okay.
Oh, before I do that, I forgot to say, Mike Holtz did run for office. He ran for the Fels Student Association president, so that happened.
Oh, okay. Hey, how you were holding out on me, Mike?
Yeah.
Come on.
A very important election. Sorry.
So that was a very, shall we say, self-interested question. No, that's cool.
Okay, so
Thanks,
back
man.
to, sorry, the question from Grant is, are there common reasons why some widely supported grassroots movements succeed while others fail? For example, the Delano grapes strike versus Occupy Wall Street.
Oh boy. Well, there's myriad reasons, but I think part of it has to do with what your understanding of a movement is, what your understanding of organization is, and what your theory of change is. In other words, in the farmer crew movement, it was pretty clear our theory of change, which was how do people come together to create enough economic and political power from moral resources. And it's an interesting way of putting it. We'll say more about that. But we knew that we had to figure out how to do that. And we also at a certain point realized that we didn't have enough in the rural California. We had to go to cities. We had to get supporters organized and so forth. But we had a very, very clear, we were heading for a particular organizational form. It was pretty clear who our constituency was. And we had a theory of change as to how we were going to get there. Not every detail by any means, because strategy is so emergent. You know, it's a creative thing, but in general. Now, you know, Occupy did a very important thing in what they did, which was to surface an issue, bring it to the public, make people conscious and aware of what was happening. But that's sort of where it stopped. And I think there were issues in their own notions of self-governance that frankly limited the potential. And so you see, movements have two natures. One is expressive. One is like, I'm going to make my voice heard because my voice has not been heard, and that really matters. The other one is, and I'm going to build enough power to change things, and that really matters. And how you blend the strategic and I want to say the sort of the narrative and the strategy, the expressive and the strategic elements has a lot to do with whether the movement goes somewhere or doesn't. Something like Occupy, it dissipated. On the other hand, it made a real contribution. It's not like it didn't make a contribution, it did. It just didn't turn into a movement for economic justice like many of us would have hoped would have happened. But I hope that gets at the question. So it's really looking at the basic, what's your theory of change? What role do you see organization having in that? And do you see structure as a friend or enemy? Because there's a tendency to say structure, yeah, but all structure is how you build something. That's literally what the word means, build. And it's simply commitments we make to each other about how we're going to work together and how we're going to coordinate and make decisions, hold ourselves accountable. And there was a lot of fear of that, I think, in the Occupy movement.
Brent sent a big thank you message.
Okay, cool, good.
All right, I think we are going to turn it over to Elizabeth, who always gets to have the last question.
The last
Thank you so
question.
much. We could have gone all night.
Yes, we'll have to have you back, Marshall. This is a long queue, still left over. Anyway, my last question is nearly always the same. I'm a little nervous to ask it of you because I'm afraid your advice will be, go out in the world and don't graduate, come back in 28 years. But my last,
Where are you? I'm not seeing you. Are you on off screen?
I'm here. I'm right here. Yeah, I'm still here. I'm the one in pink. Anyway, my last question is always, you can hear me, I hope.
Oh, I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, is always, can you tell us a few, okay, most everybody on this Zoom is 25 or so, the students, and they love to know, could you tell them a few hopeful things that you wish you could have told your 25-year-old self?
Yeah, sure. No, look, I think I was a lot more anxious than I needed to be. In other words, what's my plan? What comes next? Questioning my own sensibility, my own judgment, my own instincts. And I think that I would have appreciated having me tell myself, hey, just cool out here, It's like you got a lot going on and you're a learner and you're going to learn. And, just dive in, try it. You'll be okay. It's not like the next move is the last move, it's just the next move. Trust yourself more. That's what I think I would have, honestly, I think that's what it would have told me, told myself.
Told yourself. Well, that's wonderful. And we'll be watching to see what your next moves are, Marshall. We expect many, many more from you.
Elizabeth, can I just close with a song?
Yes. Oh, yes. Love to hear it.
Okay, but I'm not going to sing. Okay.
Oh.
No.
Well, then no.
No. In the fourth grade, I was told, please just mouth the words, and that was kind of the end of my singing career. But it's a song that Judy Collins recorded in the '60s, and it uses the word freedom because, see, the civil rights movement never called itself the civil rights movement; it called itself the freedom movement. Because freedom is a much bigger word. It's a more powerful word. It's a word of solidarity and all the rest. And the song went like this: freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it. You have to fight for it, day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother. Pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it. They have to fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again. So thank you for the opportunity to do some passing on. Thank you.
Oh, Marshall, we love you. And we've loved this time, and we thank you. And we thank you for your incredible public service and these amazing movements that you've launched, and now for teaching us and people all over the world your recipe so we can hopefully duplicate it. So thank you for all you've done and for your inspiration. We are so grateful.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone. And I hope Elizabeth shares her stories with you because she's got some good ones. And so just let you know. Thanks so much, everyone. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Marshall. You're fabulous. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.